Good evening and welcome to Bugajski Hour. I'm happy again to be back in Tirane to examine important global and local developments that affect the lives of all Albanians. And our guest today on the Bugajski hot seat is Eugen Wallfarth, the head of the OSCE mission in Albania. But first, let me give you my American perspective on the world. My subject today is China heading for crisis? Although China has surpassed Japan as the world's second biggest economy, the country faces escalating crisis. Money is flowing out of China at an alarming rate, almost $300 billion in the past year, or nearly 4% of economic output. The outflow is accelerating just as gross domestic product is slowing down. Many wealthy Chinese are planning to leave for the West, while the lower and middle classes are in open revolt. Chinese citizens stage tens of thousands of protests each year over such issues as corruption, land seizures, job safety, and numerous other grievances. A major source of anger is growing income inequality. 122 million rural dwellers live below the poverty line. If added to the urban poor, 15% of the population actually lives in abject poverty. China has reached a turning point in its development. Beijing must revamp its economy and social services if it is to avoid major social unrest. One major threat stems from radical changes in China's labor pool. China has thrived as a low-wage manufacturer, but states such as India and Vietnam are now taking away many of these jobs. Another negative is the dominance of overstaffed and inefficient state-owned enterprises. Many businesses are owned by government officials and their relatives, thus allowing a new elite to benefit from an intrinsically corrupt system. Chinese capitalist communism has reached its limits, but there are no signs of meaningful reform. Some critics describe the Communist Party in China as a cultish criminal organization that will strangle further development. Instead of opening up the system to economic and political competition, the new president, Xi Jinping, insists on maintaining the communist monopoly. For several years, China has lived with an unwritten contract between state and society. The people will accept authoritarian leadership and avoid political opposition as long as the government allows them to grow more prosperous. If Beijing cannot keep its side of the bargain, the country will be threatened with mass upheaval and potential social revolution. It is time for the Bugajski hot seat, and our guest today is Eugen Wallfarth, the head of the OSCE mission in Tirane in Albania. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for the invitation. Happy to be here.
Little background on our guest for our viewers. He has worked for over 25 years, correct me if I'm wrong, in the German Foreign Office, and has wide experience in the Western Balkans, including head of the German Liaison Office in Pristina, and division head in the European Department in Berlin. He came to Tirane as head of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in September 2010. Again, welcome to the show, and let's jump straight into the questions. Well, let me begin with a sort of general question for those of our viewers who may not quite understand what the OSCE, what sort of a creature the OSCE is. I've been working on and off with OSCE for over 20 years, and I've seen it develop, particularly its election monitoring side. Can you sort of summarize exactly what the OSCE is, what the OSCE does, and why it's important?
The OSCE started as a conference. It's now an organization, and as a conference it helps to find channels of dialogue between the East and the West to provide peace, to come closer to each other, and also to live up with standards and later with commitments to see to peaceful developments, including liberty, democracy, and the sound economic development. All these developed over times. And the OSCE presence here in Albania was established in difficult times for Albania on the invitation of the government in 1997, helping, and this is our mandate, Albania to live up to these commitments, because Albania wanted and still wants to develop, to move on, to stabilize democracy and have a better life. And that's what we are standing for, and we are helping Albanians. By the way, with a large number of Albanians, so 75% of my staff is national staff.
How big is the staff here, by the way, the OSCE?
Right now we are around 85 persons. Okay. We used to be more, but we made some progress, and also we have become over the year more efficient, and we are asked to be efficient. So it's a fine staff, and it's wonderful to work with them, and especially here in Albania, it's a rewarding country. I like it.
As a component of the OSCE, again, maybe you could explain to our viewers, there's something called the Warsaw-based Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR. And it's ODIHR that actually monitors the elections. It gathers the team, sends election monitors to different countries, even though it is a component of OSCE. But I have a very specific question. There was a comment I saw from the new head, the head of the ODIHR observation mission here in Albania, Connie McCormack, who stated that the ODIHR doesn't really assess elections or doesn't legitimize elections. But surely by being here, by giving a statement about the elections, ODIHR does actually contribute internationally, but also domestically, to either legitimizing or delegitimizing an election. It's more than recommendations. It's an important, let's say, stamp of approval or stamp of disapproval. Would you agree?
An ODIHR mission costs money. So it's serious business because it comes from the states that contribute to the OSCE, and that includes Albania. So the international community assembled in the OSCE cares. They care about Albania, therefore they invest. What ODIHR does, by the way, what the OSCE presence is doing also, we have mandates. The ODIHR mission has a mandate to observe elections and also come throughout the process, in the end, to recommendations. We, at the OSCE presence, we work with local national Albanian counterparts all the time, help to see to electoral reform. Last year there was such a big event. And this was based on recommendations ODIHR came up with after the last general and also last local elections. And therefore, these recommendations are extremely good basis for making process and base it on the observed events and facts here in the country. And they highlighted several times now already that political will is needed. And this on the Albanian side, starting with the parties, but also the whole state system. And this points to something extremely important. We from OSCE and ODIHR, as OSCE independent institution, we help Albanians to come to a fully legitimate system. So it's Albanian ownership we need to see, and where we assist and help. And ODIHR in this is having a great stabilizing effect.
But the point I'm trying to make is that the OSCE statement the statement soon after the elections, then the final report that's issued several weeks after, has an important impact. I mean, a lot of analysts, policymakers I know in Washington read this and assess the progress of any country in terms of its democratization process, in terms of its election progress and so forth. So I'm trying to stress the importance of OSCE in terms of the not just the image of the country, but the progress of that country, how it's perceived internationally. Would you agree with that?
Yes, yes. I would use the picture of a catalytic converter. So the Albanian institutions and parties and the citizens of the event, they want democracy. They have a democratic event, which is elections. This is one of the core moments in democracy, and they get assistance. And the presence of international experience in elections also keeps an eye and helps the persons and the entities involved to stay disciplined, to stick to their own rules, because all elections here are based on the Albanian constitution, on the Albanian electoral code, and the other relevant laws, including the criminal code, seeing to certain punishments if certain deeds are being done. So this is just helping the Albanian system to come to better performance, which is normal, by the way, in still relatively young democracies, and progress has been achieved over the last years.
Well, let's turn specifically now. I want to get into some detail about the upcoming parliamentary elections in Albania. How important are they for Albania's progress, not just in terms of its election performance, but the democratization process as a whole? Is Albania, in your estimation, and you know the region extremely well, is Albania moving forward or backward, or is it stationary in terms of its election performance?
It's slowly moving forward. I wished for a higher speed. It has to do with the political will in being more technical where technicality is needed. So a ballot sheet is square, there are parties on it, crossing it, and not making too much noise about it. Casting it in a box, but here you have details that are astonishing, because when you are straightforward and don't want to come in through the back door, you use simple paper. Here it's banknote style. You don't need stamps on the backside. Here you have stamps on the backside, therefore, and so on and so forth. You see a complicated system, and the more complicated the system is, the more error margins you have. I tried to convey several times, keep it simple, stay straight, let the voters vote. What should be the outcome is in the hands of the voters, but what the system should be provide is a photograph of what Albanian voters want on election day, and not distort it, not put a filter on a certain color, or distort it the other way with a magnifying or a zoom. It's the full picture of all that go to the polls, and a fair picture.
The motto has always been, or the measure has always been, and I used to be on OSCE missions, and particularly in former Yugoslavia and other parts of Eastern Europe, were the elections free and fair? That's the sort of first question, the big question that one is asked. Of course, it depends how you define free and fair, and sometimes we used to say they were fairly free, but not freely fair. In terms of Albania's progress up till now, we haven't had, I'd say, elections that had a clean, let's say, bill of health. In other words, up until now, you couldn't say they were fully free and fully fair. What makes you think that these elections are going to be any different to the past?
For me and many others, I think the most important things is one of the core elements, having free elections, is not disputed. This is fundamental. On the fairness side, this is much more complex. And I would also start with the system. Do you see it when you are a small party as a fair system, where you have a system that is more advantageous to big parties? So just to name one complicated issue. And there is no fully clear answer to it, because democracy allows for a large variety of approaches. Majority system, like in England, or a very balanced one, like some countries like Germany have it, where it's also complicated because the balancing leads to calculations an ordinary citizen doesn't understand anymore and involves the Constitutional Court. So there are many approaches, and the important thing is all have to go through the same system, which is considered legal in the country, and the Albania has a system it has, so it has to respect it and live with it. And if they see, I'm talking about the Albanian parties as a whole, see that it needs development, they should do it to the benefit of the citizens. Because what should come out in the end is a government that is able to see to progress in the country, to be able also to include the opposition. Because as things stand in Albania, for all the core parts of the reform process, a 60% majority is needed. So far, no camp, no political camp was ever able to provide 60% from one side only. So coming together to play Team Albania at the same time is very important, while of course competing, because that's what political parties are about: having the better ideas, having the better program, being more convincing to the citizens, so that they have the impression and are convinced on the election day that they vote the better option for the future. And you asked what the elections mean for Albania. They are really important. They are decisive for the future, and the very important supranational entities like European Union have made it clear what that means for the future integration of Albania.
In terms of Albania's progress towards candidacy status and so forth.
Yes.
Yeah. So these are the key elections. These are a landmark election or
These are
historic
landmark
elections.
elections.
Yeah. And let me ask you, I mean, do you fear any potential fraud or manipulation or something else that could disqualify the vote? I hear this from some people. I know that in several countries there have been suspicions that some element of the vote has been distorted, the vote count hasn't been properly done. Do you fear anything like that here in this election?
As things have developed, not. No, there is participation through commissioners in the regions, also in the counting centers, including commissioners from may I say, all political camps, which see to mutual control. And this is very important in being correct in the counting. The counting in the past was correct. A small margin of error is always possible and permitted. That happens also in very mature democracies. But here this system is proof enough to see to good counting. And when the commissioners stick to the rules, also including mutual control at the counting center, then I don't see a risk. It's good to have double control. I welcome, with many others, that there are additional provisions to even include the public with cameras. You can see elements on screen, the ballot sheets shown on screen. This all helps to build public trust that correct counting is being done. And again, it needs contribution from all sides.
Will there be a parallel vote count?
You mean the public
in other words,
doing their own calculation?
NGOs have access to voting, or to the, let's say, the list of the list of votes, basically, after the voting, to be able to check that the official figures that go to the next level are correct.
To my impression, it might be similar to last local elections, which I experienced here in the country. There was something like that, though they watched so closely, so they were in a position, indeed, to do something which looked like a parallel. It doesn't sound nice, a parallel count, but for double checking and following.
It instills confidence among citizens, yeah.
Yeah. So also sending the message through it that is closely watched, that also, this is like a police in the street. You have a tendency of less traffic light infraction when there is a policeman. But that helps to stick even better to the rules. And observing the rules, the rule of law, this, of course, also for elections and beginning with elections is a key element.
We'll go in a second. I want to ask you more specific questions, including about the Central Election Commission, which is obviously the big question now. But maybe you could give us a sort of overview of what kind of expertise and advice has your mission given to different election institutions here? Because I think one of the OSCE roles is to try and, let's say, impart the experience that OSCE has had over the past 20, 30 years, particularly with election monitoring, to help a smooth, effective, legitimate election process to take place. What kind of advice has the OSCE given to different institutions here in Albania?
The key moment was, or the key time was convincing the political parties, the relevant political parties, to come together and be open to start negotiations and discussions in preparing electoral code reform that as you know, took a very long time. There was a first attempt in October 2010. But it took then more than a year then coming together then finally, including on the level of MPs, expert level. And we, from the OSCE presence team, provided advice, including and based on the recommendations of the ODIHR after the 2009 and 2011 elections. And then these items were discussed between the Albanian interlocutors. We also had some items that are not fully reflected, like the gender issue. The position of women in this framework was improved, but not as much as we would have wished for. One of the results, you can also see that there were some punishments from the CEC towards political parties not fulfilling the 30% quota for women, or in one case even for men, because it works both ways around. So it came to also then to elements where we had additional experts present from ODIHR for electronic components. One of the innovations in the electoral code reform for electronic counting, which will be tested in the, with a pilot, or is intended at least in the FIER area, and the ID card readers, the electronic ID card readers for verification of voters here in Tirane. And
in terms of involvement of other organizations, how important is the role of NGOs, or local Albanian NGOs, in the election process? In terms of monitoring, in terms of bringing out the vote and so forth?
We very much welcome, together with other partners, that Albanian non-governmental organizations are also active, because it's Albania, and what it could not be better than having Albanians engaged in their own democratic development. I mean, that's the best you can get. I highly welcome that. I was also very pleased, by the way, when these observers were received after the elections by the President of the Republic. Very important, a very good signal, very encouraging signal that up to the highest institutions their work is recognized. And I'm happy when we are just an add-on to help Albanians to provide that. So this is probably as good as it can get. It's really, I really welcome that.
Would you say there's more involvement now than there were in previous elections, local and
slowly but surely, NGOs get more active and also more constructive, because this is also an important element. While criticizing is very important, you have positive and negative criticism, but coming up also with proposals, how to solve a question, a challenge, a problem. This is very important, and NGOs can do that as well.
We'll break for a few minutes for some ads. Well, let me ask you now very specifically, there have been reports by OSCE, by other bodies that have expressed some serious concerns about the election process. Let me ask you a few specifics. For example, this question of the polarized political environment, which is something the EU has stressed as being a major negative. It has a negative impact on democratization, on functioning of parliament. Will it have a negative impact on the elections?
The rough language used by key political players, at least by many of them, including the chairs of the big parties, is not helpful to send a comforting image that they are able to come together. Mind you, 60% is needed also after election day to go ahead with the reform process, where we are here to help to see to that reform process. What to do with the reform process? According to the declarations from all key players here, this country, Albania, wants to integrate into European structures, which includes European Union. So therefore, these reform steps are needed. How are you increasing the probability of reaching a 60% majority by smashing all the time your political counterpart and distributing black eyes? Probably not. Most likely not. So this is not building the constructive environment we want to see. So the country has to come together. The political parties at high level and the big parties have to come together and compete, civilized, compete with good ideas, compete with good programs, compete with convincing conduct, and the wrong level of words is not impressing anybody. It's shying people off, and it's not helping for trust. And it also sends a very negative image to the outside world, because while these elections are going on, also the waves, in some cases the shock waves, reach outside people. Some of them may be interested investors. And when they see the turmoil, then they probably see to something else. Yeah. And so therefore, I would repeat something which should be very clear. Albania, with the end of the dictatorship, it's not alone on the planet. They want to integrate, so therefore should also consider what image is created through action. Good behavior or bad behavior outside.
Presumably, you'd agree it would be useful to have a debate at the highest level between the leaders of the two major parties in a civilized fashion. I've invited them actually on my show here, but I don't think they want to sit together at the moment to talk. But I think this is what we do in America. However much mudslinging there is, there comes a time where you need to show the voter what you stand for and how your opponent differs from you in terms of policy. Do you think something like that would be useful here?
Absolutely. I think extending that invitation was an important thing you could do. I'm not too surprised, but I share probably your limited happiness that they did not say yes, because it would be a good opportunity also to show where are the differences, and also, and this is the most important point at this stage, to show a willingness to move forward. To come together on points that matter for the future of Albania.
And a willingness to cooperate after the election in order to pass important legislation and move the reform process forward. I mean, that's absolutely key. Let me ask a question about, has there been, to your knowledge, information that you have, any pressure on voters, any misuse of government funds during this campaign? When I say pressure on voters or buying votes, anything like this has been reported?
There are complaints. We look into that when it comes to using public funds for campaigning in undue manner. We heard reports on and claims on the national and also on the local level, and help to see that this is limited, or if not abolished. So that's part of the observation. It's clearly against Albanian legislation to use public means for campaigning, and should be also observed by all that are campaigning.
Right. It's always very difficult during an election, I know, for the incumbent government to distinguish when they appear on television, to distinguish between what's what they're reporting about the government and what they're reporting about the party. That's always a sort of fuzzy area.
Yeah. ODIHR, of course, since they arrived earlier this week, they will also look into that part, and I'm pretty convinced that it will be an element in their report.
Right. Well, let's go on to one of the burning questions. I mean, in Washington, we hear about this all the time, those of us that follow Albania closely, and that's the Central Election Commission and the problems there. As we know, it doesn't have the required mandated 7 members at the moment. First of all, would you say that the procedures were lawful for the replacement of the CEC members?
There was only one replacement that was on the government side. There was the ousting of one member in a manner that still needs further analysis on not so clear legal grounds. But I leave that first of all to the Albanian side to solve it. And it created some waves that led on the other side to some resignations that came also in different steps for different reasons and maybe also different backgrounds. What is left behind is a rump Central Election Commission with 4 members only out of 7. For the technical decisions and according to the legislation, they are operable. But legality is only one point. It is very important to have a maximum of credibility. And this, of course, is limited when you have no opposition-nominated members present.
That was my next question. How credible now is the Election Commission? Has it lost its credibility, its legitimacy?
It's not as strong and cannot be as convincing as before. The remaining 3 plus the 1 new member do the utmost of continuing the technical preparations that includes a recent testing internally of the ID card readers very recently. All these steps that are necessary to follow the code and prepare for these elections, which is very important. It's a big service, much needed for the country, and I feel pity for the remaining ones, starting with the chair, Mrs. Leshi, that they are it looks like they are criticized so much and still have to work with a lot of energy to achieve the preparations for these elections. While I'm reluctant to go into details, which led to the removal of Mr. Muho from the SMI, but it was a surprise move that still needs explanation where the legal basis for that was. That didn't come. Though there is a legitimacy question mark, but there is another one based on something else, the political will. That was also incited by ODIHR after the last elections. Where is the political will then for the other side? Are we in a tit-for-tat scenario? Or is the SP, let me spell it out, or is the SMI now outside the law and the obligations and the privileges the parties have only because another questionable step took place? Does that mean from the other side you have to be destructive and not do the maximum, being constructive, to add to legitimacy? I leave that in the end for the political leaders. I again invite them strongly to live up to the commitments, and they say they're committed to the interests of the Albanian people, so they should fill up. And when they are discontent with certain elements of the decisions or certain procedures, they can voice it. And even in Albania, it's possible to voice it in a way without using inappropriate language. And the citizens, I can assure you, from the feedback we get, would welcome this, because they want to have elections. They want to build trust in the system, and this is better done when you have all relevant political camps actively represented in key institutions as the Central Election Commission is when preparing for general elections.
Well,
so these are shortcomings. I could not speak up intensively and loud enough. I really do not understand why this tactic was chosen as a good option. It's not a good option.
You mean removing the three members? Or both, you mean, the replacement and
Leaving
the
a
removal?
gap for such an extended time so close to elections.
Well, do you think, as the opposition says, that the whole Central Election Commission needs to be recomposed? In other words, does it need to start from the beginning?
If that, it would need further explanation. Why doing that so short for before elections? By the way, Mrs. Leschi and also Mr. Biba, who resigned, did a very big effort, a very good job. They worked beautifully together, assisted by the team. So much, if not all, of what we see could have been avoided.
So you would blame both sides in this in this problem with the CEC. In other words,
yes, absolutely. Both sides with shortcomings, with actions not in the interest of the people, for very different reasons, for very different legal grounds, but in the result it's the same. So doing damage to a body that should be technical and fully operative before general elections.
Do you think that with international pressure and the realization that the elections could be somehow delegitimized, that this will put pressure on both sides to actually come together and let's say, resolve this problem with the Central Election Commission?
Definition, I mean, pressure, I would
advice,
say,
you could call it, I suppose.
yeah, because advice, yes, but pressure. This is a free country, this is a sovereign country. This is also the country that can decide on the speed of its reform, which has an effect on the speed of the European integration process. So therefore, why pressing the Albanians if they don't want to move? Okay. But it's an Albanian decision. So liberty includes, liberty is a tricky thing. I'm a fan of freedom, liberty, no matter whether you use the Germanic or the Latin word. It's very important. And it includes also the liberty for failure. And making errors.
Do nothing.
But if that is in the interest of the Albanian people, now with 23rd of June elections, the voters have a possibility to give an answer to that.
Let me ask a couple of other questions about potential problems. The campaign has officially started now, and of course it's covered very much in the media. Would you say the media environment is very polarized and tends to favor specific political interests? Not this channel, of course, but...
They cover it. Sometimes you can see from which camp they come, background-wise. I wished for some more separation between facts and opinion. Both make up, for example, a good media, but especially also good newspapers. I personally would wish, with quite some others, for more analysis of the programmatic work ahead. What to do in the social camp, on education. There is a lot of discussion also on how to provide infrastructure. All these are very important issues, but don't get enough focus in this upbeat atmosphere, where very often too much of rough language is exchanged. It should be more. It should be more on the concrete things. What helps Albania to build an even better future. It has made good progress, but more needs to come, more jobs need to be created. It needs to be defined how that can happen in this competitive environment. It's quite competitive in Europe. Many market
Sure.
You cannot even talk about niches. Almost everything seems to be complete. So you really have to be good in performing and find your niche, and that is done also through good party programs that help to see to rule of law, to have a better judicial system, all these things. These are the real issue. Not to talk about corruption even, one of the evils that clearly need to be diminished here, or trafficking, all sorts of trafficking. So these are issues, but tough issues, of course, but that need to be handled and convincingly handled in the future.
One of the problems many years since I've been coming to Albania has been these voter registration lists, whether they're complete, whether people are missing, and I've had complaints from both sides, whoever loses, that there was something wrong with the voters list. How do they stand now? Are there any major irregularities?
There seem to be no major irregularities at these times, but I can understand bringing up that question, and I also see that as a work. We see that as a work in progress, because the electoral code allows people, Albanians, that live outside, to vote, and they still appear in most cases in the places where they lived before, and many of them with unknown residency. So this, of course, while being legally required, also creates question marks on what that means. It also leads to because not all of them, only a small number will be able to travel to Albania on the election day. So that leads also that figures of participation remain lower than they could be.
And this to me is a tragedy. There's so many Albanians living outside the country. How many of them can afford or have the time to come back simply in order to vote?
Indeed.
It's a problem. It's something that should have been looked into and helped. Is OSCE playing a role in this to try and enable Albanian missions overseas to have voters come in, whether in Athens or Washington or Berlin?
If we would be invited to provide advice in this field, yes. But mind you, this is also a budget issue. While it might seem desirable, Albania has done very good and tremendous efforts that also cost money to install embassies abroad. But this is not a huge country. This is a beautiful but still relatively small country, and with a not too big state budget. It must be one must be able to afford all these expenses, and the infrastructure out there in the traditional form, like for a big state, are not yet there. Perhaps through cooperation with some regional countries that might be doable in the future, but for the time being, I see good reasons why it hasn't developed further.
Something that needs to be, I think, looked at more closely.
Affordability is also an issue, and
although these days with digital voting and so forth and computerization, presumably it wouldn't be as expensive as physically coming to the voting booth as in the old days.
Maybe democracy allows for so many options. If I may add, on a personal basis, I'm in that respect I'm still very traditional. I like to go to the voting center and cast my vote on where I made the cross on a piece of paper. So I like that. It's an experience. So we push so many buttons on a computer.
And you still read books rather than on Kindle. But
yes, and I'm not even afraid to say that. I like the sound, sometimes even from an old book, the smell.
Yes,
indeed.
I know exactly.
This is so real life.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly. Let me ask you a question. In terms of specifics, we've gone through some of these, but some members of the opposition I've heard have charged that the mission somehow is too soft on the government. In other words, that there isn't enough criticism of the government role, not just in the election process, but in the democratization or lack thereof, democratization process. Is there any political bias in the OSCE mission?
We are here to help Albanian institutions, and that includes the parliament, the government, the judicial system, the police, all these institutions to provide advice. So they are also our first addressee And that's in our mandate. And we are not an instrument of anybody on wherever in the political spectrum. Some perceptions, I know that, we hear that, we read it, we see it, are a different one, but this is not the case. Sometimes we get criticism from both sides. In election time, even very often, when we remind to stay on the track of the law, the Albanian law, because it might be uncomfortable for the tactical move in a given moment. So when we remind that, we get attacked from both sides.
So the government doesn't, because Albania is a member of the OSCE, the government doesn't try to influence you in a particular way when giving you the mandate to operate in the country? I don't just mean in Albania, but anywhere.
The government does. We have very good relations. The nominal focal point is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We traditionally have excellent cooperation with them. It's open-minded. They do not interfere. I find that fantastic, because not all the advice we give is a comfortable advice. We are also criticizing, and this is no. As a host country to the OSCE, Albania is really fantastic, and we try to pay back, also to help to use the enormous potential Albania has. There are good people here. There needs to be more focus on being constructive in stabilizing democratic institutions.
In a broader picture now, looking sort of beyond the elections, and you've mentioned this a little bit, do you agree, as some observers have noted, that Albania may be witnessing a weakening of state institutions, the rule of law not properly applied? Is there democratic regress or progress, looking at it in a broader, much broader picture? Some have even said there's creeping authoritarianism in Albania. How would you respond to this?
A very important element of your list of questions is certainly having a really professional civil service. So based on merits, so all the actions, including the draft laws on that, need not only to be adopted, but also brought to full life. And while saying this, I also would like to remind, while the professionalism of many of the existing is there, it can be better used by filling up the lines that are not with the optimum people, with professional people. And in the end, then always look at the state budget, keep looking. It's being done right now, but looking at the state budget, what Albania can afford, and staying lean and mean with really good professional people. That would help enormously. But there are already quite a lot of very good people, very good civil servants existing. So I would invite also the citizens not to underestimate these elements. And I see a potential of big progress in that part.
And the civil service presumably based on merit, not, as we used to call it, the spoils system, where whoever wins gives all the positions to their people.
Sometimes there seems also to be the tradition, when there is a change, that far too many people leave. And this is a loss of experience, if not expertise. It's very important to build up that experience. Albania as a democracy, as a country, it's old. It has long-standing traditions. It's a viable, it's a beautiful, and it's a sympathetic country. I really like it. But 20 years of democracy, with all these changes you see in the administration at many levels where it's not necessary, also lead to the fact that not enough experience is accumulated to really perform fully and take the profit from that experience in good service for the citizens.
Sure. I hear a lot of frustration, particularly from young people who are often told, well, look where Albania was 20 years ago, look at the progress that we've already made. But that's not good enough for somebody who sees how the rest of Europe operates, how America operates. Yeah. They're impatient. What would be your message to the new voters, young people?
one should not stand still here in Albania, because although the region is moving, when you see integration processes, Croatia will join the European Union on the 1st of July, so a couple of weeks from now. Montenegro is moving ahead, Serbia is moving ahead, others are also moving ahead. Why should Albania stay behind? And it's also competing. Albania should be, first of all, attractive to as many Albanians as possible, and that comes with the rule of law, the quality of life here, the number of jobs, all these complicated things. They are not easy tasks. I'm under no illusions, and no serious politician here is under any illusions, and the people should know that some patience is needed, but also some steps could be taken now.
And sometimes impatience is a positive.
The constructive impatience is the driving force.
Exactly.
And also, by the way, mind you, something which usually has a negative image, also envy. Envy has also a constructive part when you use it in the American way. Mm-hmm. The neighbor has a nice car, you also want to have a nice car and work for it.
You don't want to destroy the neighbor's car, but you want to...
Exactly, exactly. That traditional...
well, I've heard everywhere in the Balkans that it's sort of egalitarian, destructive tradition. If you have something I don't have it, I should try and destroy it. Rather, the opposite, which is competing to get the same or even better.
Absolutely, Janusz. This is so being constructive. This is important.
We'll break for a few minutes for some ads. Well, let me ask you a little bit of a controversial question. As you said, there have been some shortcomings in Albania's progress, democratization, and the OSCE has been here for about 20 years. Does the OSCE take any responsibility for the fact that Albania hasn't moved faster in its democratization process?
Maybe
it's not controversial at all.
Maybe we were not over the years not forceful enough. But then again, it's a voluntary principle. We are not here with whips. This is helping. It's an assistance. The core action and the responsibility at all times is lying with the Albanian institutions. The government, the parliament, and all the other institutions. So it's of help. We are not running the show. None of the internationals is here to run it. So to use an old picture from the neighborhood, this is not to be confused with UNMIC or something like that. We are in an assisting role. Well, we are invited for this assisting role, we have the mandate. That's why I have the privilege also to voice my advice and my concerns with one single goal: in helping Albania to move forward, but not directly through the system, in helping to stabilize and make the system even more rule of law based, and see to functionality, better functionality of democratic institutions, starting with the parliament, to name just a few key issues. Well,
there's this sort of, I suppose, tension or contradiction between having a long-term OSCE presence and the fact that Albania is an independent country, it's already in NATO, it's moving towards the EU. Do you think the presence should continue somehow? Because it is seen, whatever you say, it is seen as a sort of supervisory mission, which of course it really isn't. It's not like UNMIC, it's not like the NATO mission in Kosovo and so forth. But how do you, let's say, move forward now with OSCE presence here beyond these elections? I mean, you think it should continue? For how long? What should be the mandate?
The OSCE presence in Albania should continue. Our mandate includes I don't want to repeat it too much, but democratization, the strengthening of the institutions, human rights. By the way, there is a relatively good track record, though this is not that as problematic anymore. Big achievements have been made, and it's always rule of law in all different aspects. I would say, and this is shared also by many participating states, as the members of the OSCE are called, that we are about halfway in our mandate. That does not mean we started in '97, so some 15, 16 years ago. That does not mean that we would stay another 16 years for symmetry. It depends on how quick the country moves forward. But in achievements, I would say mission half accomplished so far, though there's enough reasons to continue.
How does it compare with neighboring countries in terms of OSCE missions? Where do you have missions in the Balkans, in other words? Where else?
We have missions in Skopje, in Montenegro, in Kosovo, in Serbia, and in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and of course here in Albania. So we had one in Zagreb, in Croatia, but for obvious reasons, now joining European Union, it was closed when the decision was taken with the accession date. So as a stimulation that for the citizens, as soon as you come close to joining, then there is no need anymore. But in the case of Albania, much still needs to be done.
Which means the path towards the EU is still going to be prolonged. It's not going to be a 2 or 3 year exercise. It's going to be presumably much longer. I mean, the steps towards union entry to get as far as
Indeed,
Croatia
experience with other accession processes tells that it is a several years process.
There's another question here which, I'm not just talking about the OSCE, but I've noticed this over the past 20 years. Albania emerged from isolation. International isolation, but sometimes one feels it's going the other way. In other words, that there's too much of a dependency relationship with certain governments, with certain institutions. Would you say that OSCE, continuing OSCE presence, as well as, let's say, the strong role of the US Embassy, the EU Embassy, and German Embassy, and others, creates this sort of unhealthy, potentially unhealthy dependency relationship where Albanians are always looking to outsiders to resolve their problems rather than to their own politicians and institutions?
There could be indeed more dialogue between the key political forces, and as things stand, with the need of 60% majority for reform steps, that includes the leaders of the two big camps. Though there should be the key to the solution, but unfortunately it's always looked for outside players, and all of us are internationals, outside players, and we should not be called as referees all the time, or then being often then seen as a partisan referee. This is not reasonable. This is not fact-based, and it's not leading to a solution. The solution should be looked for in the Albanian camps. Advice can be given from outside. When it comes to additional steps, of course, there you can be sovereign, or you can be dependent. But when you want money from international bodies, then of course you have to report, and that's where some of the sovereignty ends. The sovereign decision is to ask for money for EBRD, from the IMF, from the World Bank, and many others. But then you have to fulfill the conditions and stick to the commitments. So therefore, that's like freedom. In the end, it's not unlimited. Then you have to stick to the rules.
There's always rules. And in terms of Albania being a member of the OSCE, it also participates, or Albanians participate in OSCE or ODIHR missions abroad in other countries. What is the participation of Albanians in OSCE? How active a partner, a member is Albania?
I can tell from Vienna. There are a very active delegation there. Not only when it's directly related to the presence in Albania. They're very professional, I can only say good words. So I'm sure, but this is not my turf directly, that they also provide good advice when it comes to neighboring missions, because OSCE is based on an important, not always easy principle. It's consensus, and consensus of all 57 states, and that includes Albania, the host country.
And presumably the experience of Albanians with the democratization process would stand them in good stead when they're monitoring the process of the elections in countries, let's say, in Central Asia or some of the former Soviet republics. In other words, we've been through that experience, we can impart this to you. So Albania itself can play an important role because of their democratization process, which, for example, Germany hasn't gone through in this period, or America hasn't, whereas Albania has.
Yes.
So to use your experience as an advantage in imparting it to others, would you agree with
Yes, and they do. So the communication, sharing of experiences, and they, at given occasions, also had sent elections observation members to elections in other countries. So this exchange is clearly there, and there is an Albanian contribution.
Well, let me ask you one more question before we conclude. And as I said, I've worked with OSCE in various capacities, or tried to help OSCE in various capacities over the years. And one of the problems one has in terms of the whole democratization process is certain members of the OSCE who complain that the institution is biased towards the West, Western countries. I'm talking about Russia and some of its allies, some of its neighbors. In other words, Moscow often complains that the OSCE is biased. It's trying to impose Western standards of democracy, Western models of democracy in very diverse states. How would you respond to this?
I don't think it's a happy way of describing the situation. Liberty, freedom, of course, are a tricky thing. You have to be educated and able to handle it, and also to control it. Democracy and experience in democracy adds to that, and there is a larger number of Western countries that have experience, also the ability to share a long experience, so that might lead to that distorted pictures. But the world, including and starting the European world, has seen so many dramatic positive changes over the last 2 decades, which included the Russia that very long ago was the leading state in the Soviet Union. Now Russians can travel freely. The economy is much better than in former times. The same is true for many other countries in the region. And they are still themselves. I mean that in the good sense, in the cultural sense, and there are many approaches to democracy, and every nation also has the right to find its best approach to democracy. So I would describe that as far too short, describing it just as Western democracy. I mean, from German perspective, Poland is east of us, and is it an eastern country? Is it a western country? It doesn't matter. It's a country that has tremendously developed, which is rich in tradition, and now has an everyday more stable democracy, and it's good for us. And the same is true here in the neighborhood. It's good when you have stable neighbors, as Albania, when you have a stable Montenegro, when you have a stable Serbia, when you have a stable Macedonia, or some call it Fyrom, when you have hopefully also a stable Bosnia and Herzegovina, even more one day, and so on and so forth. Bulgaria includes even EU members, Romania. I could continue, and like in an onion, to enlarge the circle. This is very important. And in that respect, many achievements have been done and been made, and Albania is profiting from it. And now it's also time to stabilize even more democracy here. to see even more to full rule of law and take the according steps. And that includes the reform process.
What you're saying is ultimately the most stable states are democratic states. The way I see Russia seeing is for them stable states are neighboring authoritarian states. But presumably that's a short-term solution to stability and public participation.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Let me ask you a very large question. On a personal note, you will be leaving Tirane soon, I understand, presumably after the elections, to a new appointment by the German Foreign Ministry. Will you be staying in the region? I mean, your expertise and knowledge of the region, I think, is very valuable to, obviously, to the German government, but also to the region itself.
I indeed will move on. It's even a surprise to me, who is used as a diplomat to changing posts, how quick these 3 years have passed. I will go back into the German service and the region, in a very wide sense, yes, but not immediately. It's not on the Western Balkans as much I can tell. But once I'll be in the position to communicate that, you will see what I mean.
Okay.
I'm looking forward to it. It will be an interesting assignment.
Well, thank you again very much for your time, and best wishes in your new position, wherever it will be. And maybe at some point in the future we'll have you back on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janusz, for the invitation. Pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. My second commentary today on an important European topic is the spectre of Europhobia. With no end in sight to the financial crisis and the EU in disarray over its future direction, Euroscepticism is on the rise. According to a survey conducted for the European Commission, trust in the EU has fallen to a record low in all major member states. In Spain, 72% of citizens no longer trust the EU. In the UK, it is 69%. In Italy, 25%. In France, 56%. Even in Germany, considered the most pro-EU state, the number of skeptics expressing no trust in the EU has jumped to 59%. In Southern Europe, the EU is seen as stifling national sovereignty by imposing fiscal discipline and undermining the welfare state in exchange for bailout funds. For instance, in Italy, Spain and Greece, there is deep frustration with the EU for failing to oppose austerity programs. In Northern Europe, the EU is viewed as failing to control the reckless spending of indebted states and placing an unfair burden on countries dispensing bailouts. The belief among the EU's strongest supporters is that as economic growth restarts, Euroscepticism will dissolve. However, the crisis appears to be so deep that even some economic improvement may not dampen the public mood. Europhiliacs are convinced that the best solution for the EU is federalization. This would presumably include a fiscal or budgetary union, a single executive authority, pan-European political parties, and other joint institutions that restrict national sovereignty. The problem for the EU is that the longer the economic crisis continues, the less appetite there will be for a federal structure and more emphasis on national solutions. The EU is losing its reputation as an anchor of stability. It not only lacks a clear vision about its future, but also has no discernible plan of action for its own revival. The sense of a common European identity may dissipate as national interests return to the forefront. In such a climate, Euroscepticism could devolve into Europhobia as the EU project loses its legitimacy among citizens who will see greater costs than benefits in maintaining the illusion of unity. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of the show. I have, as ever, greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues here at Albanian Screen. Good night, everyone. stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miro Pavshim.